identify that and to call it out. This couple called it out in my wife and I, and so we entered a pastoral ministry with full confidence because the word of the Lord came through Peter and Linda Warren. Peter is a native Australian, raised in Australia, and God used him in a powerful way, he and his wife, through Youth with a Mission. They planted the base in Denver, Colorado, and they have trained and personally been a part of releasing over 5,000 people into missions, short-term and long-term. Peter has been able to teach all over the world. He's taught in 100 countries. And if you were here not too long ago, he spoke to us, gave us this amazing message. They're international directors, international leaders with Youth with a Mission. And they run schools all throughout the year. And those of you that want to take a next step, maybe Youth with a Mission is for you. But let's stand and welcome Peter Warren today. We bless his wife, Linda.
Hey, I have a question for you, but before I get to it, I want to tell you a story. So, once there was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, and he had to walk home from school every day because his parents worked. Both his parents worked. And this wasn't a problem. It was about a half an hour journey, and the last 15 minutes was through this deep ravine up to the other side to his house. It wasn't a problem except in the shorter days of autumn and winter. It was already dark by the time he rounded that final bend, but there was a street light outside of his house, and he would take comfort in looking at that street light as he continued to walk. One particular day, though, when he rounded the final bend, to his dismay, the light was out. Every protruding branch looked like a wild animal about to jump out. Every sound he imagined could be a person about to attack him, and he was afraid. And then all of a sudden there was a voice of a man. "Is that you, son?" It was the voice of his dad. When I got home from work, I noticed the street light was out, and I hurried to meet you so you wouldn't have to walk alone. For the next 15 minutes, they walked together hand in hand. It was still dark, but he wasn't afraid because he was with his dad. So, that's the way it is with God. He doesn't promise us an easy stroll down a well-lit, broad highway. He just promises to be with us. King David said in Psalm 23, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." And this is the point we can't afford to miss. For you are with me. So this leads to my question. Are you okay with God leading you through the deep valleys and the dark nights, and even through the territory of the enemy? I mean, David didn't say, "You kept me from my enemies." He said, "You prepared a table before me in the presence of my enemies." So are you okay with God taking you on a journey wherever it might lead, as long as he is with you?
Praise God. Well, good day, everybody. It's good to be back here with you again so soon. Linda and I were here in February, and Pastor Ryan called me up and said, "Hey, can you come back down?" And so we're grateful to be here. Carl and Debbie have been dear friends, as he mentioned, for many years. And we look pretty much the same as we did 40 years ago. But God has been with us, and I want to talk to you about that today. I want to share a story with you It happened a little over 10 years ago. And in some ways it seems just like yesterday. And I wish it wasn't a true story, but it is. It was a December night, little after midnight. Linda and I had been asleep for several hours, and suddenly we were awakened by someone loudly banging on our front door and incessantly ringing the doorbell. And I stumbled out of bed, and our house, from the landing outside of our bedroom, you can see the front door. And our son, Steve, was already at the front door, opened the door. In came two of our guys from YWAM, Youth with a Mission, YWAM. We call them YWAMers, and the little ones we called WeWhammers. So two of the YWAMers came in, and one of the guys, Anthony, said a phrase I'll never forget as long as I live. He said, "There's been a shooting at the base." Now, we call our YWAM centers bases. We live about 4 blocks away from the base. I was trying to think, what is he talking about? What, a shooting? Did someone have a gun and it went off by mistake? And then before I could think anymore, our daughter Rachel came out of her bedroom and she said, "It's Tiffany," and she said some other names. And so I ran back in, threw some clothes on, and my car was parked on the street, ran out to the car. It had been snowing. There was about 6 inches of snow. Fortunately, in Colorado, the snow is very powdery. You can sort of brush it off when it first falls, brush the snow off. We jumped in the car. When we got to the base, it was like it's not mine, good. It was like a scene out of the movies. There were flashing lights of police cars and ambulances, and in the snow, it all ricochets off of it, and the front of our entryway was already cordoned off with yellow police tape. And as I pulled up, a policeman came out with a rifle and pointed it right at me, and I rolled the window down and I said, "I'm the director," and he said, "I don't care, get out of here." So I saw I wasn't going to be able to reason with him, and so I backed the car out and drove across the street. Linda and I have 3 children. Our youngest daughter was at our mountain campus, so we have 2 campuses in Denver. One's in a suburb of Denver, the other's in the mountains. Jess was up in the mountains. Rachel, Stephen, and I were in the car thinking, okay, what do we do next? And the phone rang, and it was Linda. And Linda said, they're taking them to St. Anthony's, which is one of the large trauma hospitals about 15 minutes away. And she said, swing by and pick me up. So I swung by the house, and we drove to St. Anthony's, parked the car, walked quickly into the emergency room, and we were met by the chaplain of that particular hospital, and he knew YWAM, and he said, "Come back," and he took us back. By that time, we'd heard that 4 of our staff had been shot. We didn't know who did it or why. But he took us back to this one room where Charlie, one of the guys on our staff, was alert. He had been shot in the legs, but he was awake. And then the chaplain said, Tiffany is here also. Tiffany was the head of our hospitality department at our base. And he said, as they were wheeling her in, she's in surgery right now, but she was giving descriptions of the shooter to the paramedics. And I thought, I'm going to call her parents. I didn't know her parents, but I quickly got the phone number and called them. It's a phone call I wish I'd never made. I remember her dad saying, well, Tiff is a fighter, and I know that if she was alert, she's going to pull through. She didn't. Unbeknownst to the surgeons and the paramedics, one of the bullets had nicked the vena cava, and she was bleeding internally the whole time. She went into cardiac arrest, and she died on the operating table. The other two, Dan, Tiffany's boyfriend, was shot in the neck. Miraculously, he survived. It missed his windpipe and jugular vein and spinal cord, and Dan survived. Phil from Alaska didn't make it either. We were there all night at the hospital and came home in the morning. We were in phone conversations with the rest of our team. The police arrived less than 2 minutes on the scene after the first 911 call, and they were surgical in their approach. They had learned from Columbine High School. Columbine is in the same school district as we are, and they had learned from that event that happened 20 years ago that not to set up a perimeter and wait and give the perpetrator more time to plan his next move or their next move, but to go in. And so they went in. We had 59 YWAMers living in that one dormitory. And they found people hiding under desks and beds and in closets and thinking they were going to be the next ones. And they took everybody as they were, in pajamas or bare feet or whatever they had on, and they took everybody down to the police station downtown. They interviewed everybody all night. They didn't know if someone was in collusion with the shooter, and then in the morning hours, they released everybody. We couldn't go back to our YWAM base because it was an active crime scene. And so we piled into a bus. The church, our YWAM base is across the street from a church, and the church said, "Here, take our bus." And we drove everybody up to our mountain campus. Still, there were many things that were unclear. The next day, a whole bunch of our YWAM, my peers, other YWAM leaders from around the country flew in. They started to come in, about maybe almost 20 of them. I didn't realize how much I was going to need that personally, just for them to be with us. And it was just such a painful time. There was still just we didn't know what had happened exactly, but that next day there was another shooting in Colorado Springs. They thought it was a copycat shooter, but it turned out to be the same guy. And he was confronted by a security guard, and she shot him several times, and then he took his own life. So we're driving up to our mountain campus. We're all going to rendezvous up there, and I get a phone call from this pastor, Phil Abeda. Phil pastors a church in the inner city in Denver. And he's one of the first guys that I met when we first went there, and he's usually a upbeat guy, but his voice was cracking, and I could tell something just wasn't right. And then he said, "Peter, this was my nephew who did this. He did part of one of your schools 5 years ago." I didn't remember him, but he said, "Please forgive us, bro." He's the same one that went to Colorado Springs and did the same thing, and he's dead now. What had happened is he found it hard to forgive people. His mum told me, his name was Matthew Murray, his mother Loretta told me, and spoke to Linda, and I spent some time with her and her husband, and he said, Matthew had a hard time forgiving people. He let offenses build up, and he just couldn't forgive. And what had happened is he had some behavior issues, and he didn't finish his school, He went on, got involved in a bunch of different things, drugs and the occult, and really developed a bitterness against God. And then there was a situation that happened where the pastor of this church in Colorado Springs was dismissed because of an immoral affair he had. And this was the last straw. And Matthew decided he was going to somehow make a statement against Christians. He had purchased guns and ammunition. He had a Bushmaster XM15, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. He had a AK-47 assault rifle. He'd purchased 2,000 rounds of ammunition that were delivered by mail to his parents' house, and he planned to commit a massacre. That's what the detectives told us. His plan was to come to YWAM, stay the night, and then when people were least expecting it, to walk through the building and shoot as many people as possible. He arrived at YWAM about 11:30 at night. One of the students let him in. She didn't know who he was. She thought it was one of the other students. In the snow, it was snowing. She thought she couldn't see him. Let him in. She didn't recognize who he was. And he said, "I have permission to stay for the night." He used Linda's name. He said, "Linda Warren gave me permission to stay for the night." So they went and found Tiffany, our hospitality coordinator. And Tiffany said, "Well, Linda didn't say anything to me, and I'm not going to wake her up now after midnight, and so I'm sorry, you can't stay for the night." Our police chief, in his last public statement about this event, said, "Tiffany saved many lives." They escorted him, Tiffany and her boyfriend Dan, and two of the other staff escorted him down this hallway to the edge of our building, opened the door for him to go out, turned around, and that's when he pulled out a 9mm pistol and fired 15 rounds, 12 of them into Tiffany. Then he went to reload, and his foot somehow slipped. He was holding the door open, and as God is my witness, this door was a large industrial grade door that would never close on its own. We'd had it fixed several times. Have you ever seen a door like that? It shuts almost the whole way, but it wouldn't click shut, and you had to pull it. But on this night, the door that would never shut and locked him out. And the guys who arrived at my house a few minutes later were driving back from a concert, and as they turned around in the parking lot, they saw him there looking through the security glass, trying to get back in, and when he saw them, he ran off. He ran through the neighborhood. He had it planned perfectly where he went over fences because of the sub-zero temperature. All the dogs were in for the night. So it just worked perfectly for him. He got back to his house, stayed the night, went to Colorado Springs the next day. The police arrived. They had a canine search, issued a reverse 911 through the whole neighborhood, but they couldn't find him. And then they took us all down to the station. The next day, we got home from the hospital, and about 9 a.m, I get a knock on my door, and it's a reporter. It's a reporter from 9 News in Denver, NBC, with his cameraman. It didn't take long for the question to come up: why would God allow this to happen to young people who only wanted to serve Him? There are no easy answers, are there, when tragedy strikes? But we have to trust the Lord. And I don't have time to tell you the whole rest of the story, where actually God was amazing in what He did in bringing many people to the Lord through this event. But I've found in the most difficult times, God speaks to me the clearest. Have you found that? God speaks with such clarity when I need to hear him. Most of the time, he wants me just to keep following him and go on the last thing that he told me to do and obey him. But when I need to hear him the most, that's when he's the clearest. And this was one of those times where God spoke to me. So it was Tuesday morning. Finally, our property was released from being an active crime scene. Of course, the police don't clean everything up. We had one of our leaders and a company that came to volunteer to clean up the blood and bullet holes, patch them up. And then everybody came down from the mountains, and we crowded in, about 200 of us, into our worship center. These are all our staff and students. And we wept and laughed and just shared together. And Charlie had been released from the hospital, and he was sitting on the second row, and I went up to Charlie, and I said, Charlie, I feel like the Lord told me that forgiveness is the way forward. Forgiveness is the only way forward. And I feel that we're to go over into the same hallway across the way in the other building, and where our friends were shot, and where you were shot, and we are to speak out forgiveness to the shooter. He's dead, but we need to do that. And would you go with me? And without hesitation, he said, yes, I'll go. So I told everybody this, and I said, you don't have to go if you don't want to, if you feel like you're not ready, but Charlie and I are going to go over to the place where our friends were shot and killed, because we need to speak out forgiveness, because this is Jesus' way. And we walked out, and almost every single person went with us, and we crowded into this. You can imagine between 150 and 200 people crowded into this long hallway. I still didn't know exactly how we were going to do this. So I said to Charlie, can you pray something first? And I remember his prayer. You remember his prayer, honey? This is what he prayed. He said, Lord, I forgive Matthew Murray for what he did, because I'm not going to allow what he did to me to hinder you from me. I mean, here's this 22-year-old kid understood that unforgiveness blocks the blessing of God. You know, I wonder, just as a side note, you know the passage in Corinthians where Paul says, some of you have taken the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, and that's why some of you are sick, and some have even died, because you have taken the Lord's Supper, but you've had unforgiveness, and you've been at odds with your brothers and sisters. And I always thought, well, that's kind of a strong judgment from God. But maybe it's not. Maybe what happens is that, see, when we partake of Jesus' death, we take on his life, right? When we remember his death through taking the elements of the bread and the wine of his body that was broken in his blood, then his life floods into us. And maybe unforgiveness blocks that blessing. And somehow I understood in that moment, that's what Charlie was saying. Lord, I'm not going to allow this thing to hinder you from me by unforgiveness. And then at the count of 3, we yelled out at the top of our lungs. We made it personal. I forgive you, Matthew. And then we broke forth into that song by Joel Houston, The Enemy Has Been Defeated. Death couldn't hold you down. And I wish I could somehow get you to feel the power of that moment, because there was a spirit of fear that had rested upon our whole campus. It's one of the most powerful demonic forces I've come to believe, a spirit of intimidation and fear. And none of the students wanted to stay in the building for the night. We had our elders come and sleep in the building that first night with them, but nobody wanted to be there. And when we did this, that spirit was broken. It was like it lifted off of us through our act of saying, I forgive you, Matthew. In the following days, a lot of it is still a blur, but one of the things that I read in the media was some guy said, well, Brother Warren doesn't know what he's talking about. You can't forgive someone who is unrepentant, he said. Well, of course you can, right? You can forgive anyone. What a knucklehead that guy was. I mean, think of Jesus up on the cross. These guys, a lot of them were happy to see him on the cross. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. You can forgive anyone. But I understood what he was saying, because have you ever heard someone say this? You Christians are always forgiving, and if you always forgive, then where's justice? Sometimes justice needs to be taken care of, and if you're always forgiving, then you're doing a disservice to justice. But here's the thing. There's a difference between forgiving and pardoning. Okay? Forgiveness is personal. It's non-negotiable. We always must forgive. But pardoning is the office of someone in authority. And so if you're a judge or a jury or even a parent, it's your role to punish or pardon depending on what has taken place. But it's possible to actually achieve both, right? So you could actually forgive someone and still report a crime to the police. It doesn't mean you haven't forgiven them by doing that. So you understand the difference here between the office of authority and the personal responsibility to forgive everyone. So for us, the act of saying, God, I forgive Matthew Murray, it was us handing over to God the responsibility to punish or pardon him. But we were saying, God, we're not going to demand justice. We're giving it to you. You're the judge. We're not going to exact some kind of revenge. We're just going to release this. And it was powerful. So this was one of the darkest valleys I think we've walked through as a ministry and as a couple. God spoke to me in the midst of that. Good night. This is the problem with having a fantasy football team. God spoke to us. You know, the Bible says that my sheep hear my voice. Jesus' words are recorded. And then he spoke to us. Forgiveness is the way forward. And then we acted upon that. And it was powerful. And so the thing I want to ask you today, as I've been praying for this morning, is I want to ask you those three questions. What's the battle you're facing right now in your life? And how is God speaking to you in the midst of that battle? And what are you going to do about it? Our battle that I just described was a dark, difficult one, but he spoke to us and we acted upon it, and that was the key to the breakthrough. What is your battle that you're facing in your life, in your family? And what is God speaking to you? And let me just say, if maybe your battle is that you don't fully know him, or you don't have that full assurance that you belong to him. Romans 8:16 says that his spirit bears witness with our spirit that we belong to him. And if that's your battle because you're not hearing his voice and you're not sure. Okay, could I have the worship team come back up here? I'd like us to go back into a song of worship and surrender to the Lord, Melissa. But if that's you and you realize, I'm not hearing his voice, then I want to invite you to respond in the midst of your battle. And then part of what he's going to say requires action. It requires a response. So what's the battle that you're facing? And what is God speaking to you in the midst of that battle? And how are you going to act upon that? What are you going to do about it? Maybe you need someone to agree with you in prayer. As we go into to a song of worship. If you need prayer today, I'd love to pray for you. There's a ministry team available to pray as well. Maybe it is this issue of forgiveness. Maybe it's something else. So, in the presence of your enemies, would you lift your voice to him? And if you need prayer, I invite you just to come forward as we worship the Lord today.